Shadow edge. The edge of the shadow is one way to describe or determine if light is hard or soft. Now in soft light, there's a slower transition from shadow to highlight, whereas in hard light, the transition is very abrupt. Take a look at these two examples and study the shadow to the side of the nose. Now in the first example, you see that the shadow, the outline there, it's very crisp. The transition from the shadow to highlight is abrupt. This is hard light. Now we're going to change the light. Look at the shadow now and notice the shadow is still visible, but the edge is much less defined. There's a very subtle gradient from the shadow to the highlight. This is soft light. The direction of light, the quantity of light, those things all stay the same, but it's the quality that changes. Notice how drastically different these two images appear. Specular highlights. Another difference between hard and soft light can actually be seen in highlight areas. Hard light increases contrast. I kind of think of it like in Photoshop when I drag the contrast slider. What happens is the highlights get brighter, shadows get darker, and texture is exaggerated. Well, something pretty similar happens if you choose a harder light source in reality. The harder light source, what it does is it creates more specularity, more textured highlights, whereas with a softer light, it tends to be a little bit more even. Take a look at the highlights on the forehead in these two images. Now in the first image, you have a soft light source, and that highlight, it's really smooth, it's really even, but then when we switch to a hard light source, all of a sudden that highlight, it's brighter, it's more textured, it's more specular. What's the right light quality? There is no right or better quality of light. It really depends on what you're trying to achieve with your photography. Now, as we proceed in this course, we're going to explore this idea further. Now, that being said, for most portrait photographers, we tend to avoid harsh light because what it does is it emphasizes textures like blemishes. Because if you think about it, the transition from shadow to highlight is abrupt, it's going to exaggerate things like wrinkles and blemishes. So a soft light source tends to be preferred for portrait photography, but this is not a rule, and we will shoot all different types of quality of light. Controlling quality, relative size and distance. One of the biggest determining factors of quality of light is the relative size of the light. This is determined both by the size of the modifier and the distance of the light. Let's take a moment to discuss what that means, because honestly, it's one of the most important rules in photography when you want to control the quality of light. I recommend you memorize this rule, say it over and over and over again, because it's going to become imperative for creating great photos. Here's the rule. The larger the light source is relative to the subject, the softer the light. The smaller the light source is relative to the subject, the harder the light. So think of it this way, it's all about relativity. Think of the sun, it's massive, but it's really far away. So relative to you, it's small, and therefore it's a very harsh light source. But now let's say that you take a diffuser outside, and you put it in between your subject and the sun. When the sun hits that diffuser, basically your light source becomes that diffuser. And because the diffuser is nice and close, it's relatively large compared to the side of your subject. So it's larger and therefore softer. So it's relativity. The sun technically is bigger, but relative it's small because it's far away, so that diffuser is a big soft light source. What does this mean to you? When you bring a light source closer into your subject, you're making it relatively bigger, you're making it softer. But you can also switch to a larger modifier, which is also making it relatively bigger and therefore making it softer. So if you get a big modifier and then you bring it in really close, this is the softest light you can get. You can also go the opposite way, obviously. Now, let's say you want to create a hard light. You can use a small modifier or pull it really, really far away, or you can do both. So let's say it one more time. The larger the light source is relative to the subject, the softer the light. The smaller the light source is relative to your subject, the harder the light. You can do this by changing distance or by changing modifier size. Let's take a look at this in action. If I take this 3-foot octabox and I bring it in really close to our subject, well, compared to the size of her head, it's comparatively pretty large, which makes it softer light. So let's take a look at that. All right, so I'm gonna bring this softbox in real close, which of course is also going to make it very bright. Bring it into maybe right here. All right, and I also know I gotta adjust my exposure. Let's take a look. This gives me really soft, beautiful light. The transition on the shadow from the nose is really subtle. Same thing on the cheek. The light is beautiful and flattering on her skin. But if I want the light to get harder, the further I pull it back, the harder that light will get without changing the modifier, without changing anything but the distance of that light. Makes a huge difference. So I'm gonna take that 3-foot octabox and pull it way, way, way back. And I am going to adjust the height of it so it keeps the relatively similar angle. Something about, say, here, okay? All right, so now I know that it's further back, so I'm gonna have to open up my aperture to compensate. I've lost some light, so wider aperture lets more light in. Try the same thing. Let's make sure I have a similar angle. Like right there, perfect. All right, now this shot, if you compare and you switch between the two, the light is now much harder. And the place where you see it more obviously is in the specularity of the skin, that texture you see in the highlights. You see it on the forehead and on the cheek. And if you study the shadow on the nose, you'll see shadow on the nose is more abrupt. One place it's even more obvious is actually that shadow underneath the chin. Compare the two. The first, it's soft when the light's in real close. When I pull it back, now it's much more of a defined line because pulling the light away makes it harder. But another way you can control relative size is actually changing the size. You can change the size of the softbox or whatever modifier you have, and that will change if the light is softer or harder. So in this case, if I go from a 3-foot octabox to a 5-foot octabox, it's going to make the light softer when I go to that bigger modifier. So let me take a sample image with a 3-foot octabox. Bring it in, put it around here. Okay. All right, and I'm going to have both of my modifiers at exactly the same distance. All right, so there's an example, beautifully lit. It's still soft light with the 3-foot octa. Now let's switch over to the 5-foot and the light will get even softer. I've switched over to a 5-foot octabox. And now if you look at this, it is much larger, which is going to allow the light to wrap around her even more, but it's also larger, therefore creating a softer light source. And I've kept the distance of the front of the modifier the same away from her. Because it's so big, the base might need to move back a little bit, but we're talking about the distance of the front of the light. That stayed consistent, just those size changed. So let me take a shot with the 5-foot and compare it to the 3-foot octa. All right. First of all, I'm going to look at the shadows. When I compare the shadow underneath her neck, for example, in the first shot, it's a little bit more defined. The light's still soft, but there's a little more definition. In the second shot with the bigger modifier, it's a little bit more gradual. It's softer. Looking at these two shots, another place that I can really see the difference in the softness is, again, the specularity on the forehead. In the original shot, I see a lot more texture. The highlights are a little bit shinier. Whereas in the second shot with the bigger modifier, it's much smoother. There's less specularity. It's softer. So you'll notice, even just changing from the 3-foot octa to the 5-foot octa, keeping them the exact same distance from my subjects, makes a big difference in the quality of light.